Hi everyone, number one Marmaduke fan here. I'm still looking through my art books, trying to decide if there's some to give away. And the problem is, if I look through an art book I think I can give away, I usually find something worth looking at. Gotta be careful not to dox myself because I'm gonna be flipping back and forth between the book and the laptop. This is a topic that I think really deserves me taking seriously and doing a formal presentation on this with a lot of academic sources. But a theme of this channel is that I started it on a whim and I just talk out loud in a lot of videos. So I just want to talk out loud on this subject, maybe as a way of expressing my thoughts and why I think the subject is important to talk about in the first place. And hopefully this will be a prompt or a mental note for me to return to this subject later. So I'm looking at a Christie's catalog from London 2014. And Christie's would put out these giant catalogs of all this expensive art they're selling. And sometimes there'll be Renaissance drawing books that'll have a lot of great obscure Renaissance artists you never see art books about. And you can look at 1,000 drawings in a book for maybe $5 if you're lucky. And they'll also have these big contemporary or modern art ones. And I'm a very divided mind on contemporary art. I think one of the reasons that I became so interested in it in art school and went through this period where I wanted to make avant-garde conceptual art is I was persuaded by my teachers that if I wanted to succeed, I'd have to be knowledgeable and to excel at making this kind of art if I wanted any hope in the art market. And then I was also somewhat turned off by what I considered to be dismissive conservative arguments of conceptual art, where the argument would essentially be to show a picture of it, make fun of it as stupid, and describe it in a couple weird adjectives, and then just ignore it after that. I think the Prager, even though I enjoy Prager University and a lot of their videos, I think the Prager University on why is modern art so bad is illustrative of the type of argument I'm talking about coming from the right, where the argument against conceptual art or postmodern art is just to make fun of it and dismiss it. And one of the reasons I wanted to make this channel was I see the fight in comic books over politics in comic books as just a little part of a bigger fight. And I'm really starting to hate Twitter as much as I love the good people on Twitter who've recommended comics to me, because I keep getting in these conversations where I feel like I'm expressing my point, but then I'll have someone come back at me all salty, and they'll talk to me as if I don't take social justice seriously. And maybe part of that is my fault due to me kind of joking around online, and I need to take a Twitter break so I don't become what I hate. But I take social justice dead seriously, and I want to illustrate that by looking at a page of this, which sparked a lot of memories for me. So this is a page, I marked it, of this book is so heavy. It's even too heavy for my great book stand here. But this is a auction of a untitled film still by Cindy Sherman. This is film still number 25. This could have been yours for a mere $170,000 to $250,000. So let me show you the film still so you have a mental picture of it in your mind as I talk about it. So you might be wondering, okay, well, why is this selling for $170,000 or $250,000 if this is your first exposure to Cindy Sherman? And my answer to that would be because of the art theory surrounding Cindy Sherman. There is so much art theory written on Cindy Sherman that it's like owning a letter. It's like owning a painting by Napoleon or a painting by George W. Bush. People who spend a lot of money on George W. Bush paintings don't spend that money because George W. Bush's technique is that incredible, just judged on its own merits, but because his name is George W. Bush, and that's kind of interesting. You're owning a little piece of presidential history. The reason I think that the market values conceptual performance artwork that isn't traditional classical painting so much is they see it as historically relevant because of the effect it had on the academies and philosophers like Arthur Danto writing essays about it. So the reason I don't like the kind of Prager University big blanket dismissal of postmodern or modernist art is it seems to miss the cultural significance that these works have. And part of the point I'm trying to make here is that you could laugh at this photo by Cindy Sherman and some of the feminist buzzwords in this description of it. You could laugh about the price tag and just say, oh, tee-hee, isn't that silly that this photo sells for this much? And then go about your day like nothing interesting happened. And when I look at something like this, I'm confronted with the question, how did we come to this point in our culture? Why is Cindy Sherman's, I know why Cindy Sherman's photos sell for a lot, but why is it Cindy Sherman's photos and not any number of other feminist art students making this type of work? Well, because she came before them and she's more historically significant than them. But I got to dive into it because I'm doing my thing where I bloviate and say the same thing over and over again. So I've got to dive into this to actually make my point. So first point is, this is not an insignificant list of museums. The Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Los Angeles, and then in Chicago, Prague, touring all of the major museums in the world. In Paris, Jeu de Paume. So this is an incredibly successful. If you're judging an artist based on the major art museums showing exhibitions of their work and retrospectives on this work, this is some incredible pedigree for this photography. I would be honored if I could ever reach the point where museums would be showing my work, but would museums show the kind of work I'm now interested in making? Beautiful painting that's not necessarily purely realist, but at least a mix of realist and some abstract ideas. I don't think so. They're interested in the theory and how the theory complements the work. So this is just a mental note for me to maybe go check out these books if I ever do a more serious video on this topic. But I want to just read segments of this with you and see if anything jumps out as familiar to you. Because if you paid any attention to Comicsgate or Gamergate, I think you have heard some of these ideas being expressed. So the first few paragraphs just sort of describe what the untitled film stills are. They were works where Cindy Sherman recreated these black and white photos that are vaguely reminiscent of 50s and 60s movies, but they don't actually come out of anything. So it's not like she's copying Gone with the Wind or anything. She's just vaguely evoking the idea of a 50s or a 60s movie. In the 69 images which comprise the series, Sherman creates a world in which anonymous women are captured in ambiguous moments. Presenting the figure in a voyeuristic moment, this quality is enhanced by the vintage point she creates, which engenders her viewer to feel like a voyeur themselves on the scene. So I'm going to show you a second article that shows how Cindy Sherman's view of her own work is different than art theorist's view of her own work. But just reading this sentence, can you hear the connection between this and male gaze theory? She is evoking the idea of a voyeur, and you yourself feel like the voyeur when looking at this photo. How? Why? Well, my only answer to this is something that the feminist left is completely fascinated with, is because they're looking at old 50s and 60s movies and these film stills for examples of male gaze that they can point to as real evidence points. If all male gaze is kind of a vague postmodern theory, or if there's just this vague postmodern theory of identity, that doesn't click with people. But if you point to a 50s movie and say, see, this is the male gaze, it was made for the presumed male audience, then you have a concrete illustration of the point that a non-art academic philosopher type could click with and possibly connect with. The illustration I would use, if you ask me what's the best illustration of male gaze theory, it would be fan service in manga, where the reason I would use that illustration is a lot of young people who read manga would click with what I'm saying instantly. They would have a mental picture in their minds of how manga presents girl characters as sort of sexually satisfying characters for young male boys. Why are they drawn that way? Because young male boys are the presumed audience of manga. So Cindy Sherman's film stills are illustrating a kind of abstract and difficult to understand feminist concept of voyeurism and male gaze. As Sherman notes, of work such as Entitled, some of the women in the outdoor shots could be alone or being watched or followed. The shots I would choose were always the ones in between the action. These women are on their way to wherever the action is. So her description of it is kind of vague. She's not getting at this sort of feminist theory of voyeurism in her comment, and we're going to see more of that in the second article. I'm going to skip over this because it's museum stuff. It says they were influential in the field of photography, prompting notions of the uncanny in their strangely familiar yet undoubtedly ambiguous compositions. Sherman's series presents the artistic self through imagery suggestions of film in a way that critiques modernist assumptions and societal constructs. So, what is it? The author of this art bio, this art description, is saying her work, Cindy Sherman's film stills, are critiquing representations of women in modernist assumptions. So modernist assumptions about what beautiful women look like and how women behave in the stories of the 50s through the 70s. And then it points out that that these aren't a carbon copy of any movie which actually exists. So it creates this weird feeling that you might say, oh, I feel like I've seen a movie like this somewhere, but there isn't really a movie anywhere that you can go watch that this is based off. So it says film stills, but they're not really film stills. They're photographs that maybe evoke the idea of a film still. I read so many essays with the word simulacra in it, and I wrote essays on them, and I got A+s on them, and I still don't know what the hell simulacra is supposed to be, except some sort of postmodern buzzword I would see in all the essays I'd have. I've mentioned this in my past videos, but I feel about my experience learning about contemporary art the way people joke about lesbian dance theory or underwater basket weaving. Like, I read all this stuff, I learned all this stuff, but what's the relevance? People think algebra isn't relevant to real life. What's the relevance of this outside of a little clique of feminist art professors talking about male gaze theory? Does this help you sell burgers better? Does this help you draw pictures better or get illustration work better? Why is this important for art history classes to focus on with such fixation? And I don't know. I don't know why I live in a world that's this way, where I went to art school and this was the focus for several years of my life. I just was trying to be a good student and do what the teacher told me. And now I have all this simulacra stuff in my head, and I don't know why. Let's see. Using a host of detritus acquired by the artist over many years, in keeping with kind of the postmodern tendency of collecting ephemera and various objects to make hodgepodges of work, Sherman weaves together an elaborate persona whose identity, though familiar, is never explicit. Construing scenes that are evocative of the 50s and 60s films, Sherman mines stereotypes in compellingly persuasive narratives or visual codes, drawing from a tone of filmic practices. So all the, camera angle, lighting, framing, as well as body conventions, clothing, gestures, poses. She took influence from European cinema, she describes liking Hitchcock. So maybe one point I'd like to make here is that Sherman is not a stupid person. She is not an untalented person. So this is another problem I have with just dismissing feminist art or SJW art, having a laugh at it in like a 30-second feminism wrecked video, and then just moving on. There is intelligence to this work. I'm actually not that blown away by it. I think she's trying to evoke the idea of Alfred Hitchcock, and this is one of her better photos, but some of her photos look like someone who's LARPing as an Alfred Hitchcock character. She's kind of fumbling around trying to get the feel of an Alfred Hitchcock movie, and it's obvious it's some college student fumbling around trying to figure out how to imitate the look of this thing. But she's actually evoking the idea of a film noir movie pretty well. She's using good materials to create a interesting visual image. This isn't the kind of art that I am especially geeky about, which would be drawing and painting and the Italian Renaissance, but I can admire that she is actually using materials to create a powerful image, which looks cool. This isn't a tampon in a teacup, as Gavin McGinnis might joke about. So here's where the kicker comes. So part of the reason I'm kind of salty and wondering why I'm even spending any time on Twitter is I had a couple interactions where people were. I was talking about social justice in the arts, and I was making allusions to, like students on campus, and someone took that to mean that I think that only students are social justice warriors, that it's not a more serious problem than a few students misbehaving themselves on college campuses, and that was as far from the truth. And I think it's a problem of Twitter not being still, even with the 280 character limit, it's hard to express yourself well with that kind of a limitation. So this is an illustration of why I take social justice seriously, is because this isn't a weirdo student who's shutting down a speech. This is a philosopher who is significant in the field of art history. So it's not just the student, it's not just the teacher teaching the class, it's the people writing the books being read by the students that is promoting this sort of postmodern feminist worldview. So let's look at what Arthur Dono has to say. The stills are dense with suspense and danger, Arthur Dono stated, and they all look as if they were directed by Alfred Hitchcock. The invariant subject is the girl in trouble, all caps to indicate a kind of trope, even if the girl herself does not always know it. The girl is always alone, waiting, worried, watchful, but she is wary of, waiting for, worried about, and her posture and expression phenomenologically imply the other, the stalker, the saver, the evil, and good, who struggle for her possession. So Arthur Danto is identifying Cindy Sherman's work as, tropes versus women in video games. This is tropes versus women in 1950s through 1970s films. He's identifying kind of tropes of storytelling, and he's suggesting that Cindy Sherman's work deconstructs or confronts these tropes which reduce women to objects, which make women possessions. Patriarchal tropes in film oppress women and damage women, and Cindy Sherman is deconstructing these film tropes through her film series, or so says Arthur Danto. Now, one of the interesting things about Cindy Sherman that I learned later is the teacher says, okay, class, now that we've seen these wonderful film stills, now you have to write your essay about the work of Cindy Sherman and why it's important. So like every student, I went to Google, tried to find a few interesting articles to read to help write my essay. And then I remember my experience a couple years ago finding this. Gotta not dox myself. All right. Artsy.net, A Brief History of Cindy Sherman and Feminism. So this is the first article I found on Google while trying to look for topics to write about, by Abigail Cain. And she actually did an interesting job, I think, in writing this article. I don't care what Abigail Cain's politics are. She did her homework. So the question she's asking is Cindy Sherman a feminist? Which I think might have been the original title for this, according to the URL in Google. But now it says A Brief History of Cindy Sherman and Feminism. But the original title is more interesting because it's asking the question, is Cindy Sherman a feminist? And why does it ask that? Quoting Sherman, "The work is what it is, and hopefully it's seen as feminist work or feminist advised work," she once said. "But I'm not going to go around espousing theoretical bleep," and she uses the real word, BS, not the acronym, about feminist stuff. So this to me is fascinating. Cindy Sherman, as an artist, is saying, well, I hope that it's interpreted as feminist. I hope it's seen as feminist work, but calling feminist theory BS. That is so blunt, because I would read feminist theory and think this is so much BS. I'm reading these words, but they don't mean anything. They're word salads that don't amount to anything or don't express any concrete idea except something about male gaze and patriarchy, where I can't even pin down the point. And she's calling it BS as the artist. So now this begs the question: if Cindy Sherman, the artist, doesn't subscribe to this feminist theory art BS, why are the art theorists and the feminist theorists theorizing so much about her work? And my answer would be that postmodernism paved the way for this kind of feminist art by allowing you to say, well, it's not Cindy Sherman that's important. It's the art world. It's the community of art philosophers and feminist theoreticians that are important, and they give meaning to the work through their interpretations of it. So it's not an objective feminist interpretation that Cindy Sherman gave to the work that is objectively present in the work. It's the meaning we can pull out of it later, that the art world and the art eggheads pull out of it. And every time I would discuss these topics with my peers, they'd call me an anti-intellectual, even though I was usually at the top of the class. I was an anti-intellectual for being suspicious of the value of learning about this stuff. And the issue isn't that I'm anti-intellectual, I think. I think the issue is I don't see the value of this type of criticism. I don't see the value of this type of discussion of Cindy Sherman's work apart from reinforcing already held beliefs that male gaze exists, that it's omnipresent, that the patriarchy is real, that it functions as sort of an omnipresent conspiracy theory constantly oppressing women. It's not even that I'm not interested in talking about feminism and art. It's that I'm not interested in feminist theory being the only thing that is talked about when I talk about artwork. And I had this sort of sad experience of seeing feminist art theory and interpretation creep its way into not just explicitly feminist art, but into every kind of artwork that I love. So if I wanted to talk about Da Vinci, well, let's talk about feminism. If I want to talk about Rembrandt's paint handling, let's talk about feminist tropes in the paintings of Rembrandt. And that gets dull because I don't want to just talk about one perspective in the arts all the time. I want to talk about technique. I want to talk about the artist's biography. I want to talk about their intention of the painting and their patrons and their rivals and the competition between artists as they struggle to be the best. But as I learned quickly from feminist art theory, okay, this is a mental note. I need to talk about Linda Nochlin on why are there no great women artists. That's sort of the 101 introduction to feminist art theory. And I think it illustrates directly the point that feminist art theory is about deconstructing Western art entirely and removing concepts like beauty and merit and work ethic from the history of art itself. And what I'll give Linda Nochlin credit for is that unlike a lot of feminist theory I had to read, she's at least fairly straightforward about what she thinks feminist art history needs to do to fundamentally deconstruct traditional views of art history and replace it with a feminist lens. I don't think I'm going to read the rest of the article because all it does is it kind of makes the point that Cindy Sherman herself, go read it. Cindy Sherman herself doesn't have this sort of weird, crazy, postmodern word salad way of talking about her work. When she talks about it, she just sort of talks about the experience of making it and of trying to evoke feminist some stills. But I was kind of laughing while reading this. Maybe I should try to find the one article. The one paragraph. 1981 talks about her copying Playboy and how art forum didn't want to print it because they were worried that feminists would not like her work, even though maybe she was trying to critique sexist Playboy centerfolds. They thought that maybe she was coming a little too close to objectifying women herself. So this floats the idea that some people have talked about her work as having a voyeuristic feeling, which is what we saw in the Christie's catalog. So the Christie's catalog writer was kind of advancing this sort of voyeuristic theory of interpreting Cindy Sherman's work. She plays into the male conditioning of looking at photographs of exposed women, but she takes on both the roles of both assumed male photographer and female pinup. Assumed male photographer, male gaze, patriarchy. Patriarchy controls all photography. They talk about a film still, which was kind of controversial, and some feminist theorists didn't know how to interpret it. It's occasionally easy to spot the frustration this inspires in academics. Take feminist scholar Mulvey, who once wrote, "It is necessary to fly in the face of her own expressly non-theoretical, even anti-theoretical stance." So these theorists, including Mulvey, while recognizing that Cindy Sherman herself is not interested in this theory, or even is making fun of this theory, still want to theorize her work through a feminist lens. Why do they want to do this? What makes an academic get up in their morning and say, I am going to do some art history work. What I'm going to do is I'm going to analyze this person's photography through a feminist lens, even if they call this form of intellectualization so much BS. And my answer to that would be, well, maybe A, because academics always need new things to talk about. The new is always cool. If everyone's written about the Renaissance, if you want your PhD, you got to write about something new. So Cindy Sherman's work is new, therefore write about it, and write about it through a feminist lens and collect your PhD. And reason two would be that I think if they believe the personal is if they believe the personal is political, if they believe in the feminist ideas that they write about in the context of academic art papers, then everything is important to feminism, and feminism needs to call everything out and critically deconstruct everything. And they will find the feminist interpretation in Cindy Sherman's work, even if Cindy Sherman herself doesn't give them much to work with in that regard. This was mostly Sherman saying that she was not consciously aware of this thing, the male gaze, but was just kind of like drawing from her knowledge of photography and her experience and her memories of 50s through 70s films. So, boy, that to me should be the kicker. If Cindy Sherman is saying this BS feminist theory you see in my work, I didn't intend it, you would think that might be the end of it, but that's not the end of it. Because if the academic art world can find male gaze patriarchy theory in Cindy Sherman's work, then they're going to write about it, and they're going to talk about it, and they're going to teach students like me about it. And I think the point I'm trying to make is that this is where Squirrel Girl art comes from. The art student goes to the art school hoping to learn about art, hoping to draw, hoping to gain life experience and skills that are beneficial to them in the real world, maybe so they can go illustrate children's book illustrations or draw for comic books or work for Walt Disney. And then this is what they're confronted with. They are confronted with a concrete, very academic, very intellectual worldview, which is very, very to the left. It's not center left, it's far left. And feminist theory is not presented as an interesting set of ideas. Maybe let's have a chat about it. It's presented as true as the starting point. The 101 level, you start with the 101 essays, and that's supposed to be your groundwork you're supposed to use, and then everything that builds on that uses the feminist lens. It is the predominant or sometimes the only lens being used by students to talk about artwork. And then they come out of this experience having learned about stuff like Cindy Sherman and talked about a lot about patriarchy and male gaze theory. But what have they walked out of that art class with that is of benefit to anyone else in society from an economic perspective? And I don't know. I just sort of grieve over this, because it's not enough for me to just say tee-hee feminist art. Am I right? I see in this, effectively, I see in this the degradation of the arts as a whole, to the point where it's hard to take them seriously, or hard to take the art world academics seriously, because they write with florid prose without saying that much apart from male gaze patriarchy. And if that was my takeaway, I'm sure that was also the takeaway of people like my classmates, so that when they go interact with you over male gaze in comic books, they're drawing from things like this. They're drawing from a world like this. So I'm kind of tired. I just saw that Cindy Sherman article and kind of got triggered down memory lane to talk about this experience again. But this was very informal, and I think I really need to take this topic seriously. Because as I've said, as long as the schools teach this, if one of the conversations I had was, if tomorrow we could win Comicsgate, if we could get all the SJWs out of comics and make comics great again, that would be great. I would love to have wonderful comics where I'd always be confident buying a comic book that I would get good art and good storytelling. But as long as the universities teach this theory as the true theory, then the next generation of artists coming out of the art schools are going to have this worldview, and they are going to find very problematic beautiful women in superhero stories, or masculine heroic men saving damsels in distress in heroic fantasy stories. So immediately the SJW creep would start again, because
students act upon what they're taught to think is true, and you're ultimately responsible as an individual for what you accept as true, whether you believe these arguments are true or not, whether you buy patriarchy theory wholesale or whether you question it and get in trouble for it. But the majority of students who don't buck what teacher says are going to come out of their educational experience with this as their cultural reference point for the greatest art ever created. They aren't going to come out of it painting like, drawing like Da Vinci or painting like Rembrandt. They're going to come out of their art school experience able to talk about male gaze theory in relation to the film stills of Cindy Sherman. And I don't know about you, but I don't think you can build culture on that. I don't think you can build good, fun, entertaining stories and comics and video games and movies on that. And I don't think you can build a civilization on that. I'm #1 Marmaduke fan. I love you guys, and I'll catch you later.